This is the last fourth lecture I'm going to do with you, and we're going to turn to the topic of interpersonal communication and specifically the use of language and verbal communication in social interaction. In order to study verbal communication, we first need to have a general understanding of how the communication process works. At the simplest level, there are two participants, a communicator who wants to convey a message, and the receiver or recipient whose task it is to interpret and make sense of the message. The communicator might have a communicative intention, something they want to convey, and they then have to translate this communicative intention into a particular form of words, a message. The message may or may not be a perfect representation of the communicative intention. What the recipient receives is the message, and his or her job is to use their cognitive capacity to decode, make sense of the message that they received. Another feature of the communication process is that the communicator has to send a message using a particular channel, a particular communication channel. In the case of verbal communication, this is the auditory channel. In other words, the message has to be communicated through speech. Throughout this process, there are many opportunities for mistakes, misrepresentations, and faulty decoding to occur. The communicator may not choose the best possible form of words. The channel may limit the amount of communication that can be conveyed, and the recipient may make mistakes in decoding or interpreting the intended meaning of the message. So verbal communication is an intrinsically difficult, complex, and demanding task. There are problems with encoding, decoding, as well as channel control. As an entertaining aside, you might want to look at this short video analyzing the verbal communication strategies used by Donald Trump. Now, let's look at the two major components of communication we're going to study, verbal and nonverbal communication. These two communication mediums differ in a number of respects. They differ in channel capacity and speed. The verbal channel is transmitted in the auditory channel, which is a much more constrained or limited channel. For example, in a conversation, only one person can speak at the time, otherwise the signal is not received properly. Verbal communication is also slower than nonverbal communication, and it requires more attentive processing. The level of conscious control also differs. Verbal communication tends to assume highly conscious cognitive processes, whereas nonverbal communication typically assumes a much more automatic, simplified, almost spontaneous processing style. There is also differences in the functions of verbal and nonverbal communication, what we use them for. Verbal communication, as we have mentioned already, is conscious. It often contains a lot of symbolic abstract content, and the ability to send messages is constrained by the limitation of language, which is the obvious medium of verbal communication. In contrast, nonverbal communication is best suited for communicating attitudes, for example. Facial expressions, tone of voice, body posture can indicate whether you like or dislike, approve or disapprove of a particular message. Nonverbal communications are also much more appropriate for signaling emotions. Facial expressions and many other nonverbal cues are very good in conveying emotional information. They also are used for channel control. Because verbal communication is limited and only one person can speak at the time, we tend to use nonverbal signals to negotiate how turn-taking in speech will occur. And nonverbal signals are also very effective in managing social situations, initiating, maintaining, and terminating social encounters. If you observe the people start up a conversation, you can see a kind of little nonverbal dance of looking at the person, coming closer, changing your body orientation, trying to catch their eye, and you can only start speaking after you have gained the floor using these nonverbal signals. And similarly, terminating an encounter requires a kind of subtle nonverbal disengagement ritual. As you end up your sentence, you turn your head away, you turn your gaze away, and you slowly move away. These are very complicated, sophisticated performances, which we usually do with a great deal of automaticity without conscious control. Now, perhaps the first interesting question we should consider when we look at verbal communication and human language use, the question is language a uniquely human communication medium? In what way does human language relate to, is different to, or similar to other communication systems, for example, in animals? Many animals have sophisticated communication systems as well. Primates, bees, social insects, and these communication systems have some of the features that human language also has. The way we can distinguish between human language and animal communication systems is in terms of analyzing the features, the design features each of the known communication systems have. Hockett, an anthropologist, identified 13 different design features of the various communication systems. The human language has 13, all of them, but only 4 of them are unique to humans. These are the following. Only human language has productivity, or the ability to generate an unlimited number of new utterances, sentences, and concepts based on a limited number of words. Human language also has displacement, the ability to refer to objects and thoughts that are not present or sometimes are even imaginary. Human language, unlike any other communication system, also has traditional or cultural transmission. New words, new ideas, new thoughts, once created, can be passed on through generations to coming cultures and so ensure the evolution of civilization and social learning. And human language also has the quality of duality, which means that language units can be recombined to produce a large number of different meanings. On this slide, you will see some examples of what Hockett meant by productivity and duality, the creative nature of human language. Words can be put together in creative ways so as to create and communicate new shades of meaning. For example, if you look at the figure, there are 4 common ways in which human language creates new meaning and new communicative possibilities. Language then is the basis, the foundation of all human culture and civilization. Language is the medium of coordinating complicated group activities, and arguably the ability of humans to use language to plan, to execute complex coordinated social actions is the necessary prerequisite for survival and our evolutionary success. Language, as we have seen, is also essential for transmitting human experience down the generation and down through the ages. So cultural learning and cultural evolution are only possible because we have language. Another important feature of language is that it is essential for the representation and the creation of abstract fictional systems, for example, religions, which play a crucial role in integrating social groups and allowing the creation of shared tribal ideologies. This is an issue we spoke about before in some of the previous lectures. Now, the next point I'd like to briefly make is the question of language acquisition. Probably the most amazing cognitive achievement of humans is their ability to learn language by age 2. If you think about how a newborn infant who is not even able to coordinate their bodily movement reaches the stage by 2 or 2.5 years of actually effectively using language, this is truly a remarkable achievement, probably the greatest cognitive achievement in our lifetimes. So not surprisingly, psychologists have been wondering about how we can explain this amazing feat. And there are basically 3 different approaches or explanations that have been proposed. The first one is the learning reinforcement account, most famously represented by B.F. Skinner, who argued that language acquisition is simply a function of learning and reinforcement. Vocalization by a very young child gets selectively reinforced as they approach word-like sounds, and this is how children learn the language. The problem with this explanation is that even very young children show an amazing amount of creativity in combining language and coming out with new sentences which have never been reinforced in the past. So that suggests that reinforcement learning is unlikely to be a complete explanation of language acquisition. The other alternative is the nativist view, most famously represented by Noam Chomsky, who argued that humans learn language essentially because they are born with a language acquisition device, an LAD, which makes it possible to learn language very quickly at a very young age, simply because our brain is already programmed to acquire this skill. The third alternative is some ways the one that most resembles a social psychological account. That's associated with the work of Jerry Bruner, who argued that what children learn from the first day of their lives is communication, turn-taking, responding to the adults in their environment. Very sophisticated nonverbal communication is learned well before language evolves. So Bruner's point is that by continuously interacting with the world, very young children acquire a sophisticated interactional repertoire, which initially is non-verbal. It simply consists of vocalizations, pointing, and so on. But once the ability to use language emerges, language simply takes the place of the earlier pre-existing communication capabilities. So Bruner's theory of language acquisition essentially argues that it is the human ability to engage in social interaction from birth that develops the foundations for communication skills and ultimately makes language acquisition possible. Now, another interesting question we are going to discover or discuss is the relationship between language and the representation of reality. Language is supposed to be some kind of a symbolic summary, analysis, categorization of the reality. But language is not a precise or an accurate representation of reality. For example, different languages use different linguistic terms. There are cultural differences. For example, in the English language, a male sibling is called a brother, irrespective of whether the sibling is older than younger. In other languages, for example in Hungarian, we have 2 words for a male sibling. Báty denotes an older male sibling and öcs denotes a younger male sibling. So Hungarians represent the reality of kinships in different categories from English. Another example is the way colors have different names in different cultures. The principle seems to be that a language tends to use the simplest category system that still maximizes communicative content. But historical, cultural, and simply coincidental features have a great influence on the particular words that a language uses. Here is another example. In English, because of the Norman conquest and the infusion of Latin words into the Anglo-Saxon base, we have two words for pig and pork and cow and beef. One denotes the animal and the other denotes the cooked version of the animal. Pork and beef are the Latin origin words, pig and cow are the Saxon origin words. But chicken and fish, for example, do not have that difference. So in some ways, the words we have to map reality are partly arbitrary and subject to the coincidence of historical changes. Uh, Next, we're going to look at a very interesting feature of language. We might call this indexicality. The idea that language is indexical. And what that means is that verbal utterances, sentences, are always dependent for their interpretation on already existing shared knowledge between the communicator, the encoder, and the recipient, the decoder. Every sentence, every communication we use capitalizes on what we assume to be already known. So sentences index shared knowledge. That means that speech is always incomplete and its meaning partly relies on what is already assumed as shared knowledge. If you look at the cartoon on the left, take a sentence like, "She's a butte gnome, what is she? A 24-footer?" Now, what does this sentence mean? It could mean a lot of things. If you are looking at a boat, then they are talking about the boat. But if you are looking at herpetology, people who fancy snakes, then they are going to talk about their pet animals. The meaning of the sentence is not complete. Part of the meaning comes from the already understood and pre-existing shared knowledge. You see an illustration of this in the YouTube link at the bottom of the cartoon, illustrating how people explain plots of films already capitalizing on shared knowledge. Here is another example of indexicality in language. The fact that the meaning of any sentence depends on the context. Actually, you can say that anything, any sentence can be made to mean almost anything, depending on the pre-existing shared knowledge. Let me give you a simple illustration. Take a sentence like, "Let's go to McDonald's." That's the sentence. And let's say that this sentence means, "Let's go and kill your grandmother." Now stop for a moment and try to make up a little context, a little situation, a background in which "let's go to McDonald's" will come to mean "let's go and kill your grandmother." And it's actually quite easy. Let's assume that two people, John and David, have been planning to kill John's grandmother for quite a long time. John's grandmother lives in the McDonald's. John and David have previously agreed that before they go to kill the grandmother, they will definitely go and have a hamburger in McDonald's. And given this shared background knowledge, David telling to John, "Let's go to McDonald's," this sentence will mean "let's go and kill your grandmother." Any sentence can be made to mean anything if you simply make up a surrounding story in which that meaning becomes useful. Now, next we are going to look at a very interesting and important feature of language, and that is the strange relationship between language as the medium of social communication and language as the medium of social thoughts, internal thought. There is a link between communication, the language we use on the outside, and thinking, the symbolic use of language for internal information processing. To the extent that different cultures have different linguistic repertoires, use different words, they think about reality in very different ways. For example, in Somalia, there are 46 different words for camel. The Somalians can think about camels in a much more sophisticated way than we can, who only have one word. The Eskimo have many different words for snow because that's important in their culture. The Hanuman Mangyan culture in the Philippines apparently have 92 different words for rice. So when you have different words, you have a different representation of reality. The words you use can determine the way you map and understand reality. This is sometimes called the Shapir-Whorf hypothesis because it was proposed by these two researchers based on their study of different languages. Another fascinating feature of language is that particular groups or cultures or communities, as they interact with each other, are necessarily going to develop their unique terms that only they use and only they understand. This kind of language use has a secondary function. It helps us to indicate our belonging to a particular identity group. Jargon terms are a signal of group identity. And there are many examples of that. When I was a student at Oxford University, it took me a little while to learn, for example, that when you know the Oxford jargon, then Magdalen College is not pronounced Magdalen, but it's pronounced Magdalen. That is a signal that you know how people speak in Oxford. Using terms like going down, that means going to London, and going up means coming up to Oxford. So terms like going down, going up had very specific meanings in that particular language community. Many other professions or groups develop their own jargon terms or language. Medical jargon is well known to everybody. Legal jargon is also an example of how a particular professional group uses their own preferred way of speaking, not necessarily to facilitate communication, but partly to indicate their special status and professional knowledge. Psychologists are also not exempt from this tendency to use jargon to indicate identity, as we are going to see on the next slide. Psychologists are also very fond of using jargon, and jargon can be created very easily simply by combining complicated words into different phrases. In this table, you see a guide to almost meaningless jargon. I actually created that simply by making 3 columns of words and then suggesting that any word from column 1 can be combined with any word in column 2 and then column 3, and that will give you a scientific sounding, important sounding expression, which actually doesn't really mean anything, but it could be inserted into a psychological publication and people might believe that you know something that they don't. Look at some examples. Ongoing personal constructs or confirmatory individual evaluations or successful natural reactions or manipulative conceptual predictions. Any word in column 1 with any word in column 2, add any word in column 3, and you will get something that does sound like a nice psychological jargony expression. Jargon terms naturally evolve as a group of people interact with each other. On this table, you see some of the most commonly used jargon terms at Princeton University with their definition. For example, a wonk in Princeton means an introverted student who studies all the time. A star is somebody who is the center of attention or is an athletic ace. A lunch is a graceless, socially unattractive student. These terms are very similar to the student prototypes that we have studied at the University of New South Wales, which we spoke about in an earlier lecture. And just to convince you that jargon is a very common and very easily available option in language use. On this slide, I listed 3 different jargon generators on the internet. If you click at any one of these jargon generators, you will find a program that will easily produce jargon in a given area. For example, there is sci-fi bullshit generator, corporate bullshit generator, Deepak Chopra New Age bullshit generator, and marketing bullshit generator. All these programs will produce impressive sounding but essentially meaningless linguistic terms. Now, next, I'd like to say a few words about a very interesting and relevant aspect of the social use of language, which in a way follows from the Shapir-Whorf hypothesis, the notion that language as a means of communication is also the means of thinking. The idea that language is the external medium of communication and also the internal medium of thinking gave rise to the notion that if we can regulate the communicative functions of language, we might be able to control or regulate what people think. If we make sure that people use language in a particular way, then perhaps after a while they will not be able to think in any other way except the way language has been regulated. This idea was nicely developed in the novel by Orwell, 1984, which describes a futuristic dictatorial political system that developed a language called Newspeak, which is intended to control the thinking of all members of that society. Now, this idea has actually been implemented in dictatorial cultures in the past. Nazi Germany, the communist Soviet Union or Yugoslavia, and now, of course, in China, the Chinese Communist Party, do exactly what Orwell described. They inhibit certain forms of language and they insist on people in their public communication using language only in a particular way that the dictators approve of. Has this been successful? Did people really change their thinking as a result of historical examples of language control? But the evidence is not encouraging. Historically, there has been little success. Decades of absolute language control in countries like the Soviet Union or Yugoslavia, up to 70 years in the case of the Soviet Union, failed to change the beliefs and attitudes of the citizens. Yugoslavia is an interesting example. Yugoslavia used to be a communist country made up of 7 different ethnic republics who habitually hated each other. The Serbs disliked the Croats hated the Serbs, they both didn't like the Macedons. So it was essentially a country where ethnic dislike was endemic. During the existence of Yugoslavia for some 45 years, any public reference of ethnic dislike was prohibited. Radio stations, newspapers were never allowed to write or utter anything indicating ethnic dislike. As soon as Yugoslavia collapsed in the late 1980s, ethnic hatreds broke out almost immediately. The Serbs, the Croats, the Macedonians, the Slovenians started not only hating each other, but actually fighting each other in a military confrontation. So 2 generations have grown up with complete language control, and yet their attitudes towards each other apparently did not change at all. The general idea that by controlling language's communicative functions, the open external exchange function, we can change people's thinking hasn't quite gone away. Even today, there are attempts and ideas that believe that by regulating language use and controlling and eliminating disapproved words, people's thinking and ability to think disapproved thoughts will be constrained. There are a number of such forbidden expressions. On the next page, you see a language code guide from one of the American universities, which basically argues that words like colored, Eskimo, ghetto, hip hip hooray, Hispanic homosexual, ladies and gentlemen, long time no see, Mr. and Mrs. Ms., rule of thumb. These words and expressions are prohibited, and when you look at the table on the next page, alternative expressions are required in order to not use these terms. Australia is also interesting. Since the 1950s, different words have been used for migrants, which initially tended to be pejorative. Balts, because some of the migrants came from the Baltic countries, refos for refugees, later New Australians. Currently we have words like asylum seekers or refugees. All of these words eventually took on a slightly negative, pejorative connotation. President Obama argued that people who seek refuge in the United States should now be called dreamers in order to get rid of the negative connotations of the other words that have been used. A particularly interesting example is the United States, where over the decades a number of different labels have been invented to describe the black minority population. So terms like Negro, Black American, African American, person of color came and went because whenever a new term was invented, after some period, it tended to acquire the negative connotations of the earlier term that it replaced. What that suggests is that the underlying attitudes prevail, sometimes even when the language is changed intentionally. Now here is an example of an inclusive language guide. Proscribed or prohibited and prescribed or required words are listed and the reason given. So for example, a word like colored is deemed to be racist, but people of color is okay. Eskimo is supposed to be racist, but you have to refer to the specific tribe and that's okay. Ghetto is racist. Using the name of the neighborhood is okay. Hip hip hooray is racist. Hooray is okay. Homosexual is sexist. Gay, queer, or pansexual is not accepted. Ladies and gentlemen is sexist. Everyone, people is acceptable. So as you can see, even previously neutral or innocuous words can take on negative connotations and may come to be prohibited. There are many examples of contemporary attempts to control thinking or change thinking by regulating language and enforcing particular language use. One objective is to eliminate binary sex categories, anything that refers to male and female, or men and women being different, and enforcing the use of terms which no longer have a gender association. So for example, breastfeeding is out, but chest feeding is in some contexts. Another interesting way in which people use language to influence thinking is that some words are explicitly designed to communicate disapproval or abnormality of attitudes which are considered to be politically incorrect or unacceptable. For example, if you take a word like homophobic, that actually means a pathological fear of sameness, which is totally meaningless. What it intended to signal by using the word phobia is that any negative attitude towards homosexuality should be considered a clinical case abnormal and to be condemned. Similarly, transphobia, whenever you attach the word phobe to anything, what you're really signaling is that people who have those attitudes are to be considered abnormal. Another example is the term climate change denier. Adding the term denier implies that there is an absolute scientific truth that cannot be doubted. And of course, there are no scientific truths of that kind. Any scientific hypothesis is always open to questioning. So denier is supposed to indicate the existence of an absolutist belief. Violations of language rules typically result in some social censure. You will be called out, cancelled, uh, and people who criticize you for unapproved language use essentially engage in what's being called virtue signaling. They can indicate their moral high status by questioning the language use by another person. Woke is a word that describes a particular culture which is particularly attentive to inappropriate use of language. Cancel culture is another term that describes the tendency that once somebody is called out for inappropriate language use, there is often a concentrated group effort to attack that person for their inappropriate use of language. So political correctness as a means of improving thinking often takes the form of language rules. As the video on this slide will suggest, probably a better way to guarantee that people respect each other and behave in a decent manner is to appeal to alternative methods of using language. So click on that video and see what you think about those arguments. Another particularly interesting controversy has surrounded attempts to change personal pronouns. Personal pronouns are much more difficult to change because they are very deeply embedded in the structure of language. They're used very automatically. Children learn personal pronouns very early on. So changing nouns or verbs may be possible, but changing personal pronouns is typically very difficult. The move to change personal pronouns comes from various movements that claim that they do no longer want to use by gender, male, female words to have this to describe themselves, and they demand that other people should adopt that particular use. At the bottom of this slide, you see a summary of proposed alternative personal pronouns that you should be using. So instead of he, she, you should use sie, him, her, you should say zim, his, her, you should say zir, his, hers, you should say zis, and himself, herself, you should say sie self. Now, that is the expectation, and the argument for it is that by doing this, you are not violating the human rights of individuals who do not want to be identified as male or female. It turns out, not surprisingly, that many people find adopting and learning these new personal pronouns very difficult, and quite a few refuse to do so. There is a strong controversy, particularly in Canada, where proponents of free speech argue that it is not legal to force people to use language because of political demands. Jordan Peterson, in particular, has been advocating a view that the enforced use of invented language terms violates fundamental individual freedoms. Even people who don't take a very strong reaction, trying to insist on language use which is not naturally evolving in a community, runs the danger of possibly eliciting adverse reaction, which is not what you want to achieve when you want to pursue greater tolerance towards different minority groups. In addition to the two major fields of studying language, semantics, the study of meaning, and grammar, the study of structure, there is a third field, pragmatics, which refers to the study of language as it is used in everyday communication. Effective verbal communication requires a speaker to obey a number of important rules or requirements. Grice argued that the following 4 conversational postulates are necessary for effective communication. Quantity is the first postulate, the requirement to be as informative as necessary, but not more so than needed. Quality refers to the need to be truthful and reliable in what you communicate. Relevance refers to the fact that your communication has to be relevant and not digress to irrelevant contents. And manner is the requirement that in your communication you should avoid obscurity and ambiguity and to be brief and orderly. You can look again at the video about Trump's communication, which illustrates how Trump regularly violates these conversational postulates. In verbal communication, people sometimes also reveal contents, messages which they are not intending, simply by their choice of words and the way they express themselves. This refers to verbal leakage. In one interesting study we carried out with Poya, Laszlo and Forgas in 2010, we asked participants to talk about painful, difficult episodes in their past. One of the dependent variables we analyzed is whether they use past or present tense in describing these painful episodes. It turned out that the use of present tense indicated that the problem was not resolved. The use of past tense indicated subconsciously that the speakers were no longer concerned about the difficult situations that they described. The way people communicate in everyday situations, the pragmatics of language use, can be influenced by a number of factors. In a number of experiments, we have found, for example, that mood state, the way a person happens to feel at the time, has a significant and measurable effect on the effectiveness of their communication strategies. In one study, we induced people into a positive or a negative mood, and then we asked them to tell a story to a partner. What we measured is the effectiveness of their verbal communication strategies in terms of Grice's conversational postulates. As you see on the figure, people in a positive mood tended to think more superficially, less carefully, and committed more mistakes in their communication strategies. People in a negative mood tended to think more slowly, more carefully, and more attentively, and generally communicated more effectively compared to the positive mood condition. Social psychologists studying pragmatics often look at communication situations as they occur in everyday life. One common feature of communication is that sometimes we find ourselves in a conflict situation when we have to say something, but none of the options are really entirely desirable. Imagine that your best friend gave a terrible talk at a seminar, and then he turns to you and asks, "How did I do?" You have only two options. You can lie and say it was great, or you can tell the truth and hurt his feelings. In such situations, people tend to employ language choices which essentially satisfy the requirement of saying something without saying anything much at all. This is called disqualification or equivocation when people use non-committal language. In the seminar situation, you could possibly say to your friend, "Well, as can be expected," or "Gee, it was a difficult topic." In either case, you avoid giving a meaningful answer. The actual selection of words can also be revealing of a person's subtle subconscious preferences. For example, imagine that you have the task of describing your own group using 3 positive and 3 negative characteristics, and describe another group in terms of 3 positive and 3 negative characteristics. Now, even though you have the same number of positives and negatives for both groups, people can reveal their preferences by using general abstract terms for the positive category for the in-group and specific concrete terms for the negative qualities of the in-group. And vice versa, the out-group can be described, the positive terms can be specific and isolated, and the negative characteristics can be abstract and general. This pattern is called the linguistic intergroup bias. The good qualities about my group are general, the bad qualities are very limited. The good qualities of your group are fairly limited, and the bad qualities are very general and abstract. The theory that predicts this linguistic intergroup bias was put forward by Shebin and Fiedler, who were the first to argue that studying the level of abstractness in the words used can be indicative of internal preferences. As we have seen before, producing language, using language, necessarily requires the use of cognitive information processing strategies. We need to think to produce a verbal output. Several experiments and studies show that positive and negative mood has a differential effect on people's information processing style. In a positive mood, people tend to think in a quick, superficial, simplified way. People in a negative mood, on the other hand, tend to think in a more cautious, attentive, and systematic way. So we might examine the interesting possibility that people in a positive or a negative mood will produce significantly different verbal communication strategies. In one experiment published in 2007, we asked happy or sad participants to produce persuasive messages, trying to convince another person of a particular idea or attitude. We then analyzed the quality and the concreteness of the persuasive messages, the verbal messages they produced. And the results showed that in a negative mood, communicators used more polite and more elaborate request forms, both when the situation was easy and difficult. And furthermore, the persuasive arguments produced in a negative mood also turned out to be more efficient and more effective in changing attitudes, as you can see in the figure on the right-hand side. In another similar experiment, we used manipulated mood to see how it influences the way people make requests. Making a verbal request is a tricky kind of a verbal communication because you cannot be sure that your request will be successful. We again asked happy or sad participants to formulate requests in situations that were easy or difficult. And as you can see in the figure on the right-hand side, people in a negative mood were far more polite in formulating their requests and also used more complicated and elaborate verbal strategies. It's as if in a negative mood, people have become more hesitant, processed the information more carefully, and formulated requests that were more polite and more elaborate. Choosing the right words in a social situation is a particularly difficult and challenging task when you're trying to make a good impression on another person, ingratiation. In a recent experiment with Diana Matovic and myself, we have found that when people are induced into a negative mood, they tend to process information in a more careful and systematic way compared to people in a positive mood. In this study, our participants watched short films, video films that were designed to make them feel happy or slightly sad, and then they had the task of engaging in a verbal interaction with another person, trying to make as positive an impression as they possibly could. We then analyzed the quality of their verbal responses, the messages that they used, and found that those participants who were in a negative mood produced significantly more effective strategies to create a positive impression. Their verbal messages were rated both as higher on social evaluation and indicating greater competence compared to the positive mood state condition. This result is consistent with the prediction that slight changes in information processing strategies, in this case induced by moods, can have a significant effect on the success on how people use verbal communication in pragmatic everyday situations. In this last fourth lecture, we looked at language and verbal communication in social interaction. Language is a unique human evolutionary achievement, and as we have seen, language is the basis of symbolic thought and also culture and the tool that allows us to integrate large social groups. Language has a dual function. It is the tool of external communication, and it's also the tool of internal thinking or symbolic thought. The language we use is shaped by history, conventions, and culture, and as we have seen, different groups use different language terms to describe the same reality. The verbal categories we use are necessarily an imperfect representation of reality. We have also seen that language can be used to signal status and identity when people adopt particular jargon terms to signal to others their group identification. A very important aspect of language is that by manipulating language, controlling the external communicative function can sometimes serve as a means of trying to change thinking, the thoughts that people are capable of processing. We also looked at some experiments in pragmatics, looking at how language is studied in everyday social situations.